Today on With All Due Respect, we will be talking about the Paris attacks and their political fallout from a variety of angles. The states saying no to Syrian refugees, the global response, and what the 2016ers are saying. But before all that, on a day when the biggest headlines were all about Paris, let's get the latest first word news from our colleague Mark Crumpton. Mark?
John, thank you very much. Secretary of State John Kerry is in Paris to show American solidarity with France after Friday's deadly terror attacks.
Don't mistake what these attacks represent. This is not a clash of civilizations. These terrorists have declared war against all civilization.
Secretary Kerry arrived in the French capital under unusual security precautions. Journalists accompanying him were not allowed to report about his planned visit. It's believed to be the first such restriction for a Secretary of State's travel to a European capital. Republican governors in at least 10 states say they will no longer accept Syrian refugees because of the attacks in Paris. Those states include Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, and North Carolina. However, it's unclear how they would stop refugees from resettling in their states. Maine's governor says his state will continue to accept Syrian refugees. Congressional security officials are advising lawmakers to stay vigilant in the wake of the Paris attacks, and a new video purportedly posted today by Islamic State. A fighter in the video vowed to attack Washington. Security officials say lawmakers should take all necessary precautions, including using the secure underground tunnels between congressional buildings more frequently. You can get more on these and other breaking stories 24 hours a day at thenewbloomberg.com. From the Bloomberg First Word Desk, I'm Mark Crumpton. John, back to you.
Thank you, Mark. Let us bring in now another Mark, a different Mark, my partner, Mr. Mark Halperin. Today, Mark, President Obama set the agenda at the G20 summit in Turkey, with questions swirling around what the global response will be to the Paris attacks, including calls for more American troops in Iraq and Syria. The president recommitted to his strategy to fight ISIS, and his frustration showed through.
There have been a few who suggested that we should put large numbers of U.S. troops on the ground. And keep in mind that we have the finest military in the world, and we have the finest military minds in the world. And I've been meeting with them intensively for years now, discussing these various options. And it is not just my view, but the view of my closest military and civilian advisors that that would be a mistake. Folks want to pop off and have opinions about what they think they would do. Present a specific plan. If they think that somehow their advisors are better than the chairman of my Joint Chiefs of Staff and the folks who are actually on the ground, I want to meet them. And we can have that debate.
So, Mark, my question to you is why is the president standing pat with his existing strategy, and why do you think he seems just as frustrated as he does?
You know, he, at that extraordinary press conference, and it was extraordinary. If you haven't seen it, you should go on the web and watch it, because he is frustrated because he thinks his critics, as he said quite clearly, don't actually have a plan that would work better than what he's doing. And he's standing pat because, as where we are right now, he doesn't think any of the facts that led him to believe that more aggressive action was a bad idea. Nothing's changed. It's tragic what happened in Paris, but it doesn't change anything as far as he's concerned. Yeah,
I think that's certainly right. And obviously this is a moment in which a lot of political grandstanding is taking place, and on all sides, from every angle, people making lots of macho kind of tough talk about how we need to now decapitate ISIS, how we have to kill ISIS, how we have to destroy ISIS. If it was that easy, it would be something I think even this president, given his relatively restrained approach to military force, would certainly have embraced. It is not that easy. And when a discussion, if this discussion now moves to what would actually be required in terms of troops on the ground, people's views will sober up pretty quick, and I think President Obama knows that.
What's surprising to me today is he's laid down a lot of markers about stay the course and why that's clearly the best position. There are things coming up in the days ahead that could change that. I don't think public opinion in America is going to change, and I think that's a lot of what the president is basing this on, as well as his own view about what would work based on advice he's getting. But I think there are bigger things than just rational analysis that may come into play here.
I think that's probably right. Although, like I said, I do think the president has, he is tired of listening to people criticize who are not in the position to actually do anything about the problems that they're criticizing.
In a speech today to the French Parliament, President Francois Hollande was quite clear in saying that his country is at war with ISIS, and he extended that country's state of national emergency now for 3 more months. The world is wondering, is France going to invoke Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which would compel other members of the alliance to come to its defense, which would, of course, include the United States? John, how likely is it, through NATO or in some other way, that France is going to bring the international community along for a more robust, on-the-ground operation in Syria?
I think not that likely. Certainly there will be a lot of solidarity expressed. Certainly, I think the intelligence sharing will increase. But I think that the reality is, as Olivier Roy wrote in the New York Times today, a really strong, sharp op-ed, it is the case that, as tragic as this might sound, France is really the only country in the world for whom the eradication of ISIS on the ground is a top priority. There is not another country, either in the Middle East or elsewhere, for whom that's true. It is the case that everyone would like to see ISIS go away, but not in the same way that France does. In some ways, France is isolated, and that will make it hard, I think, for them to generate the kind of coordinated, very tough military response that some people seem to think is coming.
French politics now is going to be fascinating because you cannot build a coalition if you're France from a standing start. They just don't have the standing of the United States. It's not clear what kind of private conversations have been going on. I've been trying to figure that out all day. If they invoke Article 5 and if they try to get NATO to rally to its side, it's not clear what exactly that means, who would lead this effort. And France is, as you say, isolated, not just in terms of its current posture, but in terms of the downsides for other countries who just don't have the same emotional need politically to respond the way France does in some way.
Right. I'll tell you, as you know, I was in Paris over the weekend, not to cover this story, but on my own, and it was a kind of extraordinary moment. There's no doubt what has changed is the tone and tenor of the French response within France, where after Charlie Hebdo, there was a different kind of feeling. There's now a lot more fragility, a lot more fear, and a lot more sense of urgency that whatever happens on the international stage, a lot is going to change domestically in that country. All right, and now we have a message to the Syrian refugees. You are not entirely welcome here. Governors in more than a dozen states, mostly Republicans, declared their intention today to close the door on allowing more Syrian refugees into their states. Those declarations arrived in a flurry this afternoon after the president had implored Americans to act compassionately towards those refugees. President Obama also took a direct shot at Republican presidential candidates who've been suggesting that only Christian refugees should be accepted into this country.
When I hear political leaders suggesting that there would be a religious test for which person who's fleeing from a war-torn country is admitted, when some of those folks themselves come from families who benefited from protection when they were fleeing political persecution, that's shameful. That's not American. And so I think it is very important for us right now, particularly those who are in leadership, particularly those who have a platform and can be heard, not to fall into that trap, not to feed that dark impulse inside of us.
Mark, a handful of governors have said that they will take more Syrian refugees, and House Speaker Paul Ryan has said that Congress is looking at the issue. So here's the question. The White House has previously called for settling 10,000 Syrian refugees in this country. How much of a problem, politically speaking, do you think this growing list of defiant states is for President Obama and his policy?
This kind of political dynamic brings out the worst in a lot of politicians, including a lot of governors, and including the governor of New Hampshire, who's a Democrat who's running for the U.S. Senate. The White House has to hope that things cool down, because this kind of red-hot thing, if it sustains, could interfere with the budget process, probably won't interfere with resettling the refugees. People don't quite think through this. If a refugee settles in one state in our country, they can go to any other state they want.
Yes, well, it is. If we were doing our newly minted segment with no due respect, Mark, I would be calling out the governors of all these states. It's not clear that they have the legal authority to do this at all. This is the worst kind of shameless posturing and grandstanding you can imagine on this issue. I'm with President Obama entirely on the fact that it's un-American, but apart from that, as I say, it's also wildly impractical, and potentially not legal. But it is something that we've seen play out in a dramatic way, in a slightly different way in the issue over Gitmo. The president knows how difficult it is when you have recalcitrant states. It could be a problem for him. But again, I think the main thing we want to focus on right now is just how shameless these politicians are who are doing this for purely, I think, political reasons.
Well, and the symbolism of on the one hand, saying we don't think the president's doing enough to help the people who are suffering at the hands of Assad, and then on the other hand saying, well, every other country in the world will take them in. We don't have the technical know-how to figure out how to bring them in and make sure we're only bringing in people who are true refugees. It's kind of ridiculous. Yes,
and politicians who correctly say we're not at war with Islam, then saying, well, we'll take the Christian refugees, but we won't take the Islamic ones, even though the Islamic ones are the ones who are suffering most in that country.
Right.
Terrible.
All right, when we come back, a few of the Republican presidential candidates are responding to what's happened in Paris, and we'll take a look at how that could reshape the fight for the Republican nomination. Back now in 60 seconds. Since Friday, many of the Republican presidential candidates have been weighing in on a regular basis about the Paris attacks. Some of them have called for more American troops on the ground in Syria without specifying numbers in many cases. Others have blamed President Obama for what they say is an alleged lack of leadership. We're going to go through some of those responses now, starting with the two frontrunners discussing Muslims in America. Today, Ben Carson delivered a statement and an address in Henderson, Nevada, and Donald Trump phoned into Morning Joe to express his suspicion about Muslims in this country. So, John, let's start with Trump. He has not done as much media as some of the other candidates since Friday. But on Morning Joe, he suggested that, like in some other countries, looking at this in Europe allegedly, that perhaps you have to consider doing more surveillance on mosques and maybe shutting down mosques.
Yeah, look, I mean, Donald Trump to the extent that he has been able to get traction in this race, it has been by playing from the very beginning on a lot of fears of a lot of immigrants and a lot of fears of a lot of Americans have about the other in America. And it doesn't seem at all surprising to me that he's still playing this hand. I think the question that I have is whether the establishment views about Trump and Carson is that both of them will now have a hard time if foreign policy gets elevated in this race. I'm not sure that's true, given what we've seen in other countries, where the candidates who are outsider candidates and candidates who are strongman kind of candidates sometimes, and leaders, sometimes get a lot of traction from moments like this. And that could actually help Trump in particular, not so much Carson, because Trump is a different kind of candidate profile.
All right, let's look at what two of the establishment candidates who have been very outspoken since Friday have said. Jeb Bush and John Kasich, they've emphasized that they've got executive experience, elective experience, and that's what the country needs, they say, to fight an enemy like ISIS. In their TV appearances today, both men argued that the election is not a time to take a chance on choosing an untested candidate.
We should have no empathy for our enemies. We should destroy them, plain and simple, which means a strategy in the Middle East to do just that. And I believe the American people are anxious for a leader to create a strategy to go in, settle this, and then move on and get back to fixing the things in our own country that are broken.
I'm talking about specific action on the intelligence level. We don't need just bombast now. We need solid plans. This is not about sound bites. This is about real policy, and you've got to understand the implications of all of this to be effective.
Okay, and then there's Senator Ted Cruz. He's trying in some ways to be both an anti-establishment candidate and demonstrate that he understands public policy on these issues quite well. His campaign put out a video over the weekend that replayed some of the darkest images of terror and also linked it up with an action drama soundtrack and cut in video of Cruz himself.
We stand in solidarity with the people of France, with President Hollande, with the families of all of the victims of these acts of horrific terrorism. These attacks underscore that we are facing an enemy who is fierce, who is relentless, who is at war with us, even if our own president doesn't understand that it is at war with us.
So, finally, even Mitt Romney weighed in. He appeared on the Today Show this morning with Savannah Guthrie, and he criticized President Obama for not doing what Romney thinks is required to defeat ISIS.
When you're fighting a war, you say, we're going to win, we're going to do whatever it takes. And the president has not been willing to do that. So it's time for us to get serious about this, for us to come together as NATO and finally eliminate ISIS.
Would you run in 2016 under any circumstances?
Savannah, I've said it I'll say it again today, which is I'm not running. I'm not planning on running. This is an issue of great consequence. And the fact is, I care about the country. When you run for president, as I have, and you lose, it doesn't mean you stop caring. I care very deeply, and I'm concerned that what the president's doing is not conducive to America remaining safe. And we have to change course. This continuation is not acceptable.
So Romney weighing in there, very similar to the other candidates and being pretty condemning of President Obama. But, John, back to the topic you raised, which I think is the key one here. The conventional wisdom in the establishment is that their candidates are now going to rise up and that the anti-establishment candidates, particularly Carson and Trump, are going to have a harder time making the argument that they should be nominated. Is that conventional wisdom going to turn out to be correct?
Well, look, Mark, I think one of the things it really depends on is how much this issue stays with us. And I know it seems today, again, having literally today just gotten off a plane from Paris and having spent the weekend there, this issue is obviously in the front of my mind and at the front of everyone's mind in the world. But one of the things that we have seen repeatedly in this cycle is how fast things move and how evanescent even what seem to be seminal issues turn out to be. So is this going to be the predominant issue that we're talking about 3 weeks from now, 3 months from now, or is this going to very quickly fade away, as kind of appalling as that sounds? That's one of the questions that I have, and that will have a big impact, it seems to me, on the dynamic that we're talking about here, whether the establishment candidates get traction from this or whether the insurgent candidates can somehow figure out a way to capitalize on it.
There was eventually going to be a day of reckoning, maybe right before Iowa, where the party was going to have to say which of these 7 or so most likely nominees is actually ready to be commander-in-chief, ready to face off against the Democrats on national security. That day has come now to some extent. I think Trump is going to do very well in the short term because he's appealing to the people who already support him on things like immigration, on things like toughness. I think all the establishment candidates, Christie, who's been very outspoken and I think quite skillful in the last couple of days, Bush, who's giving a big speech on Wednesday at the Citadel, and we'll interview him on national security tomorrow here, Marco Rubio, all of them, and John Kasich, who's giving a speech tomorrow on national security, all of them have a chance to overcome the fact that they had not established a signature profile on this issue up until now, and none of them have served in the military. None of them look like the normal kind of person the Republicans nominate, even in terms of Romney, who was very fluid on foreign policy when he ran last time.
Right. Here's the real test, it seems to me. There are two issues, right? We're hearing a lot right now about the refugee issue. That is an easy issue in the Republican Party because it plays right to the Republican base. Everyone is now going to be wanting to crack down on the refugees. That doesn't get to the commander-in-chief threshold. To me, the commander-in-chief threshold that these establishment candidates have to meet now is as they all talk about, like Kasich and Bush are talking about, how we need a real plan of action. So what would their actual plan of action be? Not just win at all cost, not just do whatever it takes. This is really a war, Mr. President, but okay, what's your plan? How many boots on the ground? What are you actually going to do? What are you going to say that puts some meat on the bones of those declarations? That's what I want to hear from those establishment candidates, and that's the only way it seems to me that they win this argument, if they actually show that they have credibility and detail and mastery of what they would do in this situation if they were president.
I talked to Barry Bennett, Carson's campaign manager, last night. He was unyielding in saying that he didn't think the so-called establishment experienced candidates had real experience, and that he was ready to have his candidates stand toe-to-toe with the establishment candidate on these issues.
Well, we'll see how that works out for Ben Carson, I'm sure, in the days and weeks ahead. When we come back, we'll talk about Paris and the Democrats after this. So far in this presidential race, Hillary Clinton's tenure as Secretary of State has been both an asset and a liability for her. but there's no doubt that her foreign policy and national security experience dwarfs that of Bernie Sanders and Martin O'Malley, her two remaining Democratic rivals. So, Mark, let me ask you this question. We have a two-parter. Here's part A, okay? Is there any way that Hillary Clinton doesn't benefit politically from these attacks in Paris, in terms of the Democratic nomination fight?
I think unless Senator Sanders or Governor O'Malley really find their voice on national security, not so much criticizing her, although there was some of that over the weekend, but figuring out how to make it clear to people they're ready to be commander-in-chief from day one, I think any national security crisis is probably going to be good for in the nomination fight. And I think both those guys are so focused on domestic policy, I don't think they'll find a way to get to that point.
Right. I mean, I think one of the things that obviously came out from that debate that you attended in Iowa over the weekend was the Sanders campaign being upset, complaining about the shift in national security questions at the last minute in the wake of the Paris attacks. I mean, it gives you a sense of just how uncomfortable they are on that terrain going up against Hillary Clinton. There is obviously a pacifist wing of the Democratic Party, but it's not big enough, I think, to overcome the weakness that Sanders and O'Malley have on this issue and the strength that Hillary Clinton does have on this issue. So let's move on now to part two of the question, the longer range question, which is whether there's any way these attacks and their fallout could actually weaken Clinton against Republicans in a general election.
Yes, if Republicans find a nominee who's strong on national security, I think the president's record is in the balance. She'll distance herself somewhat, but she will have to live with his legacy, not just because he was Secretary of State, but because they're the same party.
Again, though, as you pointed out, and I think there's no doubt President Obama's foreign policy is the weakest part of what she would be inheriting legacy-wise on the Democratic side. At the same time, you still listen to her talk about foreign policy and national security. She's so much more fluent on those issues than any of the existing Republican candidates. They can obviously grow, but she has a big head start going into the general election when it comes to talking about these issues with confidence, with authority, and with intellectual dexterity. You just don't see that right now from anyone in the Republican field.
You know, national security is one of the big areas where what hangs in the balance for the Republicans is, can a nominee emerge who emerges stronger for having fought through this big crowded field? And national security will be one of the areas where they'll have to fight. Can someone find their voice on national security in a way where the party says this would be a great president, this would be a great commander-in-chief, and can that person come through unscathed or at least not fully dented in a way where they can say national security is something that I want to talk about against Hillary Clinton? They certainly want to go up against the Obama record. But as you said, she is knowledgeable and formidable on these topics.
Right. And it's also, of course, the one thing we always have to stipulate. There's so many unknown unknowns and known unknowns about what might happen over the course of the next 12 months in terms of further terror attacks, either, God forbid, in this country or any place else in the world that could obviously change the contours of the race in dramatic ways. Okay, so up next, we'll have former State Department official and columnist for the Sunday Times of London, Jamie Rubin, an old friend of Mark and mine, who's going to join us to break down the Paris attacks and the international response. We'll be right back for that.
Welcome back to With All Due Respect. I'm Mark Crumpton, and this is a Bloomberg First Word update. On this Monday, the U.S. Department of Defense says France is officially off limits to American troops and employees on their free time. The department-wide ban applies to all military personnel, civilian employees, contractors, and family members. It prohibits personnel from coming within roughly 30 miles of the French capital. Exceptions have been granted for U.S. military assigned to diplomatic posts. French President Francois Hollande says he'll ask Parliament to extend his country's state of emergency. The move would increase police powers and limit public gatherings. Today, the president addressed lawmakers and called on the United States and Russia to join forces with France in the fight against Islamic State. And it was a moment reminiscent of World War II. After addressing Parliament, President Hollande led his countrymen in a moment of national pride. And you can get more on these and other breaking stories 24 hours a day at thenewbloomberg.com. From the Bloomberg First Word Desk, I'm Mark Crumpton. John, back to you.
Thank you, Mark. It's time for us to bring in our first guest of the evening. That's Jamie Rubin, who is the Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs and State Department spokesman during the Clinton administration. He's now a columnist at the Sunday Times of London, where he wrote a prescient piece this month titled "Beware ISIS is now a threat to the entire world. Jamie joins us from London. Jamie, thanks for coming in so late there. My first question for you is, at this moment, as it always is in the wake of a horrific attack like this, every politician in the world stands up and blames some other politician, whether it's President Obama or somebody else. At this moment of kind of widespread blame casting, who do you think actually deserves the most blame for the growth and spread of ISIS?
Well, I think you've really put your finger on why it's such a painful time in the political system. Look, I could give you 6 or 7 realistic and honest answers to that question. Obviously, the colonial system created an Arab world in which these people never learned how to govern themselves. The Sunnis are fighting the Shiites, and that's crucial to what's going on with Islamic State. There's the question of Saddam Hussein getting it all started by invading Kuwait, and all of the went through that. There's President Bush invading Iraq in the first place. There's President Obama for pulling the troops out, perhaps a little prematurely. Then there's the whole question of Syria creating basically a vacuum into which the Islamic State now has a place, a home, in which they can plan, train, and organize. And as the French president said, this operation in Paris was planned there. So I think there's plenty of blame to go around, and I just hope that the politicians, the leaders, can get this blame-throwing phase over with quickly and start to focus on what's really, really important, which is how will the world be organized to gather itself, its powers together, and eliminate this essentially a terrorist state in the heart of the Middle East, where terrorist acts can be planned and organized and terrorists can be trained and come and go. And that's what has to be done.
Jamie, let me ask you about a question we raised earlier on the show. President Hollande has called this an act of war. He's calling for solidarity with Russia and the United States in terms of fighting ISIS. Do you think that he will now try to invoke Article 4 with NATO? And if he does that, what do you think will be the likely outcome?
Well, John, I did some checking on this over the last couple of hours, and to my surprise, frankly, it appears that the French are resisting and avoiding NATO altogether. Not only are they not interested in invoking the clause, which is Article 5, about an attack on each country, but Article 4, which you referenced, is merely a consultative phase where the ambassadors get together and talk about what an attack might mean. And it appears very clear that the French do not want to involve NATO in this, which is a shame, because what's the problem? President Hollande is saying the Russians should work with France. The United States should work with France. We don't have a very good system in our world for organizing a coherent, burden-sharing operation so that those who are good at one task are doing that task, and those who are good at other tasks do that task. The only way that's happened successfully in the past is when Washington, the President of the United States, organizes the world for that purpose. And that hasn't been happening either. So that's what worries me, is the French aren't looking to NATO to help do that. They're just saying the Russians and the Americans should work with them. But how do you organize this? Who's in charge? Who are the lines of communication? And in military spheres, knowing exactly who has what responsibility is absolutely critical if you're going to do a good job.
Jamie, what do you think Vladimir Putin thinks about what happened in Paris and what the implications are for his country?
Well, I think that Putin has had a big problem in that he has taken the side of the Shiites in this grand war, the Iranians, Hezbollah, obviously Assad in Damascus, and that Shiite side now has a majority. The majority of the world's Muslims are Sunni, have begun to see Russia as their enemy. The first step in that was the taking down of this plane last week, which was the sign that ISIS was going to move away from action in the Middle East and take the fight to their enemy, which in this case is Russia. So that's a long way of saying that I think after Paris, Putin doesn't feel so alone. That having the French, who have always had a very special relationship with the Russians, different than other NATO countries, and I think he is hoping that he can work closely with the French socialist president, after all, and perhaps see Russia get the kind of international stature and international respect that Putin craves.
So if France does not ask for NATO's help in an official way, what do you think the right response for the United States is?
Well, it's tough. I mean, we can't tell them exactly what to do. But I would certainly hope that regardless of what Hollande says or what Putin says, that the President of the United States realizes that it really is only the United States that has the combination of military, political, and economic power in our world to diplomatically organize a combined operation, because this is going to have many components. It's going to have a law enforcement component, an intelligence function. It's going to have obviously troops on the ground, not American, but there are countries in the region that have offered forces under the right circumstances, and a greater American air component, and that has to be deconflicted with Russia's air component. And I don't think any of that will happen unless the President of the United States takes this task on as the major final function for him as president in his last year in office. If he doesn't do that, I fear it'll be much more ad hoc, and there will be far less seriousness of purpose, and I fear, therefore, that the mission may not be achieved as quickly as it should be.
Jamie, very quickly, about 30 seconds here, just give me a sense of what you think about these dozen or so governors who've come out today and said no more Syrian refugees should be allowed into their states.
You know, America is a great country. I'm so proud of being an American. I represented the United States in the State Department. When I hear governors say like that, it saddens me. I mean, we are a nation, above all, a nation of immigrants who came to our country in time of need. You know, the famous sign on the Statue of Liberty. This is not a big job to separate the potential dangerous people from the men, women, and children who are suffering. I mean, at minimum, you could offer to take elderly and women and children, but to just say no Muslims or no Syrians is not the generous American people that I know and respect, and it certainly doesn't do any credit to those states where the governors are saying that.
All right. Thank you, Jamie Rubin. Great to have you. Thanks for staying up late for us. Coming up, we asked two top political strategists about how the Paris attacks changed the 2016 equation. After this. We are joined now by two of the most brilliant political strategists that we know and great friends of the show. Democratic strategist Steve McMahon and Republican royal strategist Ben Ginsberg there in Washington, D.C. Guys, it's taken as kind of for granted that the Paris attacks and the fallout from them are going to have a big effect on the 2016 presidential race. I want to ask you both just to talk a little bit, starting with you, Ben, about the Republican side. Just look at the field of candidates and tell me who you think is strongest and who is weakest in terms of the responses they've offered up so far and in terms of the potential they have to, in some way, capitalize politically on what's going on in the world right now.
Well, so far, the candidates who have managed to talk to the real anger and the grassroots out on the state level are the ones who have done the best. The sort of more Washington-based answers about process, I think, have not resonated as well amongst the primary electorate. Those who have shown a grasp of the issue and sort of fluidity of thought obviously benefit also, but appealing to the sort of outright anger and shock of the grassroots has been, I think, the most successful responses so far.
Steve, there's a little bit of tension in Ben's answer, and I want to ask you about Republicans, even though you are mainly an expert when it comes to Democrats. You know, there is this view that the establishment candidates who've governed something before, have run something before, are going to benefit because they are grown-ups, and that what the establishment sees as the fringe candidates like Trump and Carson will somehow will not be to their benefit. They will be hurt by this. Ben seems to be saying that being fluid is good, but appealing to the base is also really good politically. Try to untangle that for us right now.
Well, I think he's trying to explain why Donald Trump was doing so well and is still doing really well. You know, normally the establishment would be right. I think having some fluency with the subject and having some experience managing something that's significant and approaches the kind of seriousness that this will require would be an advantage. But here in the Republican field this year, it doesn't seem to be. It's sort of bombast and you know, whoever can be the most outrageous and the most bombastic seems to be winning, and that's Donald Trump. And I think, you know, people think he's strong and decisive, and they may think he's a little reckless, but frankly, the anger in the base is probably going to reward that in Donald Trump right now as much as anything. We'll see. This should be a moment for Jeb Bush, but it's not clear it will be.
Steve, first, then Ben, if you were working for Bernie Sanders, what would you tell him he needed to accomplish on national security and foreign policy before the Iowa caucuses?
Well, I would tell him he needs to actually sit down and do a little studying and figure out what he wants to say about it. I thought his opening statement, where he kind of gave 2 sentences to it and then he moved on to his stump speech, was a little tone deaf, to say the least. And the fact that he doesn't really seem to show much interest in foreign affairs and foreign policy, I think, is a little bit of a problem for him right now. It's worked for him up to this point when foreign policy and foreign affairs were not an issue in the campaign, but they are now. They're front and center, and that works for Hillary Clinton.
Ben?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. I mean, I think wearing the socialist Democrat label is really, really more challenging when foreign affairs like this, the country feels ill at ease, come to the fore. And so he's got a lot to overcome in terms of convincing people he could actually be a commander-in-chief at this moment.
Ben, back to the Republicans. Between Christie, Kasich, Bush, and Rubio, who do you think has the best chance to wow everybody in the Republican electorate with their foreign policy and national security chops before Iowa?
Well, look, Marco Rubio is the guy who's on the Foreign Affairs Committee.
But he never shows up, Ben.
He showed up plenty. He can still talk about the issues really, really well. Jeb Bush has the name Bush, which ought to be helpful to him. Chris Christie is a former prosecutor, and so being appropriately bellicose at times like this is a strength of his.
Ben, you're listing them all for me. Which one has the best chance to break through?
I started off with Marco Rubio as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Steve interrupted to put in a partisan plug, which I can't blame him for.
Okay. Steve, let me ask you this question about Hillary Clinton. If you were advising her, I'm going to presume that you and I both agree that she is by far the most likely Democratic nominee. If that's the case, and if you were advising her on the politics of foreign policy, what would you tell her was the biggest vulnerability that she would have in terms of foreign policy heading into a general election?
Well, I mean, I would say that the biggest vulnerability that she has is her vote for the Iraq War. I thought the one time where Bernie Sanders prosecuted his case pretty effectively in the debate was when he was talking about the instability that resulted from the invasion of Iraq. Now, she has admitted since the vote that was a mistake, and she's apologized for it. I don't know what more you can do. And there's not going to be a Republican on the other side who didn't support the war with enthusiasm and pom-poms. So I don't think it's as much of an issue in the general election, but I do think in the primary it's certainly probably something that's going to be discussed a little bit more. And I think, you know, that's probably her only weakness in the area of foreign policy. And compared to a Republican that she might be running against, it's no weakness at all.
Ben, if we had more time, I would get you to admit that Hillary Clinton was far superior as a foreign policy candidate to any of the Republicans. But we are out of time, unfortunately. So I'll leave that for another day.
I'll agree with that.
Steve McMahon and Ben Ginsberg are two great friends. Thanks, as always, for coming in. Up next, what you did not see after the debate in Iowa over the weekend. We'll be back with that in 60 seconds.
Coming out of Saturday night's Democratic presidential debate in Iowa, Hillary Clinton has been taking some heat from her rivals, mostly for one moment from the debate. When pressed on her contributions from Wall Street, she justified them by saying this.
You know, not only do I have hundreds of thousands of donors, most of them small, and I'm very proud that for the first time, a majority of my donors are women, 60%. represented New York, and I represented New York on 9/11. When we were attacked, where were we attacked? We were attacked in downtown Manhattan, where Wall Street is. I did spend a whole lot of time and effort helping them rebuild.
That 9/11 line has been getting a lot of heat for Hillary Clinton, including from the New York Times editorial page and also from her rivals. Yesterday in Iowa, we caught up with Martin O'Malley and Bernie Sanders. Here's their reaction to that 9/11 comment.
I thought last night was a pretty disgraceful moment when she tried to put out a smokescreen invoking 9/11 to hide the fact that she's taken millions in contributions from the big banks of Wall Street, not to mention all the hundreds of thousands in speaking fees. I mean, it is what it is.
Well, I think I have no idea what the connection is between Secretary Clinton's efforts and all of our efforts to help rebuild New York City after that disaster with the fact that Wall Street contributors over her lifetime have been the major source of her funding.
Look, there is no campaign without gaffes. But in the first two debates, we've had two major gaffes, both of them from Secretary Clinton. I mean, we understand that a lot of Republicans attack her, but golly, does she have to keep giving them so much ammunition? The first gaffe was when she declared in the first debate that she's proudest to say that all Republicans are her enemies. Well, how the heck are you going to get much done in our country if you declare that all Republicans are your enemies? The second gaffe was last night in a very, very distasteful way, trying to pump out a smokescreen for her coziness with the big banks of Wall Street by invoking the tragedy of 9/11 and those attacks, especially so fresh after so many were murdered in Paris.
John, she's taken heat from all quarters on this 9/11 remark. Do you think it will linger and be a problem or fade away as the debate fades from memory?
I think it could linger and be a problem, or just because of the fact that it does get to one of the great vulnerabilities she has. I mean, it is the case that whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, being close to excessively close to Wall Street is not a positive place to be in terms of pure politics. And look, I mean, it is the case that she was a huge a recipient of Wall Street cash long before 9/11. And then there's the kind of cheapness of trying to invoke 9/11 to justify yourself. All of it, I think, is not great. It's not the kind of thing that's going to end her candidacy. It's not going to bring her down. But it is something that will be picked at and picked over for a long time to come, I think.
Unlike Sanders and O'Malley, Secretary Clinton has not taken any media questions, at least that we know of, since the debate. So she's not been asked about this. As her aides have been asked about it, they've tried to not seem defensive. They've tried to explain away what she said. But I suspect when she's asked about it, she's going to have to make remarks about it. There's a lot of private grumbling in Democratic quarters that this was not only something that was unfortunate to say, but to go to what Martin O'Malley said. They look at it as kind of an unforced error, when she was forced to go off her talking points in the debate, when she felt on the defensive about this issue of Wall Street contributions. She wasn't prepared with a smooth answer, and she kind of reached for 9/11 under circumstances that, again, most people, including the New York Times editorial board, felt was not an appropriate thing to do.
Yes, I think there's no doubt. There's no doubt, like I say, I think she's going to hear about it again and again. And, there is the question of the Clintons and money. Is a question of enduring interest, both for the press and for all of her rivals in both parties. No one is inclined to let Hillary Clinton off easy when she makes a mistake of the kind she made on that debate stage. And so I think no one is going to let her off easy this time any more than they ever do.
Yeah, it's interesting because you see in the fallout from the debate, that's the kind of thing that, as I said, everybody's attacking her for, including the Republicans, but also her Democratic rivals. And I think if it does start to die on its own, you're going to see it brought back up by O'Malley and Sanders and maybe by their supporters in ways both open and a little bit below the radar.
Right.
All right, we'll be right back after this word from our sponsors.
Day, but it can never be said enough that we are on the television set twice a day at 5 p.m. and 8 p.m. and we are live 24/7 on BloombergPolitics.com. When you visit the site, make sure you check out our campaign tracker for the latest 2016 updates, along with a terrific piece by Max Abelson about how Wall Streeters are reacting to that Hillary Clinton debate line about 9/11.
On tomorrow's show, we sit down for an in-depth interview with former Florida Governor Jeb Bush to talk about national security and foreign policy. We'll also preview a speech he's giving at the Citadel in South Carolina on Wednesday. It's going to be a big day for national security tomorrow. We'll have Jeb Bush. We'll also have John Kasich's speech, and Governor Bush. We're going to cover a lot of topics with him on being commander-in-chief. So we'll see you tomorrow. South Carolina interview with Jeb Bush. Thanks for watching. Sayonara.